Rain fell in delicate silver strands over Manhattan as a man in a grey custodian's uniform pushed a mop bucket through the marble lobby of Sterling Roth Industries, a corporation valued well beyond $100 billion. No one gave him a second glance. No one imagined that the unassuming man wiping down glass doors was the sole living heir to the empire towering 60 floors above his head. When the young CEO, Victoria Sterling, later reviewed security footage of that same man repairing a robotics unit worth $8 million in under 6 minutes, she did not feel gratitude. She felt threatened. Within the hour, she ordered him terminated for overstepping the boundaries of his position. By the end of that single day, the entire executive floor would fall silent as the company's founder walked in and asked one question that ended Victoria's career as she knew it. The morning had started like every other morning that autumn, grey and damp, with commuters ducking beneath umbrellas as they crossed 53rd Street toward the glass tower that housed Sterling Roth Industries. Dorian Vance arrived 2 hours before sunrise as he always did, badge clipped to his uniform, his face unremarkable beneath a plain grey cap. He greeted the security guard at the loading dock with a brief nod and nothing more. No one on the custodial staff knew his last name carried any weight in the city. He filled his cart with cleaning supplies, checked his assignment sheet, and moved toward the West Wing without a word, the way he had for the past 4 months since he first walked through those doors as an anonymous employee of a third-party contracting firm. No one on the 42nd floor spoke to him either. Engineers in expensive jackets stepped around him as though he were part of the furniture, occasionally letting a stray comment slip about the smell of floor cleaner or the inconvenience of a cart blocking a hallway. Dorian never reacted. He had learned over many years of building and losing and rebuilding a life he chose for himself. That silence taught him more about people than any conversation ever could. He watched engineers argue over deadlines. He watched junior staff flinch whenever a certain name was mentioned. He watched managers take credit for work they had never touched. And every evening when the towers of glass emptied out, he wrote nothing down because everything he needed to remember, he already understood. That particular morning, a young engineer named Ethan Cole was rushing to calibrate an experimental warehouse robot before a client demonstration scheduled for later in the day. His hands trembled slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep, and in his hurry, he triggered a diagnostic override that sent the machine's servo arm crashing into a steel support column. Sparks jumped from the joint and the unit collapsed into a heap of twisted metal and blinking error codes. A machine worth $8 million reduced to scrap in less than 4 seconds. Ethan's face went the color of the concrete floor beneath him. He knew what a mistake like this could cost him. Not just in dollars, but in the career he had spent a decade building. Dorian happened to be mopping the corridor outside the lab. When the crash echoed through the glass walls, he set his mop against the cart, walked inside without asking permission, and knelt beside the fallen machine as though he had done this 1,000 times before. He studied the exposed wiring for perhaps 90 seconds, said nothing, then reached into a small pouch at his belt that no janitor should have ever needed to carry. Ethan watched in stunned silence as the stranger in the grey uniform rerouted a burned circuit, reset 3 internal calibrations, and coaxed the robot back onto its feet within 6 minutes flat, its diagnostic lights returning to a steady, healthy green. Then Dorian rose, collected his mop, and walked away before Ethan could even say thank you. The security footage reached Victoria Sterling's desk less than an hour later, forwarded by a nervous junior manager who assumed she would be pleased that disaster had been averted before the client demonstration. Victoria watched the footage twice, her jaw tightening with every replay. She saw brilliance in those 6 minutes, yes, but she saw something else, too. Something that unsettled her far more than a broken robot ever could. She saw a man who did not belong in that room, acting as though he owned every room in the building. Victoria Sterling had clawed her way to the top of a company built by someone else's genius, and she had learned that control was the only currency that mattered. She slammed her laptop shut and buzzed her assistant. "Get me the name of the janitor on camera 3, West Wing, 42nd floor," she said, her voice flat and cold. "And get someone from Human Resources up here immediately." A member of the custodial staff just put his hands inside a restricted engineering unit without authorization. "I want him in front of me before lunch." Rebecca Hart, the head of Human Resources, arrived at Victoria's office already uneasy because something about the request felt disproportionate to the offense. A broken machine had been fixed for free, and somehow that had become an emergency. Rebecca pulled the employee file before making the call, and what she found gave her pause, a background so plain it seemed almost deliberately vague. No notable education listed, No prior references beyond a staffing agency. Nothing that explained how a cleaning contractor understood servo calibration well enough to repair equipment that had confounded certified engineers for most of the morning. She said nothing of this to Victoria. She simply placed the call and waited for the man named Dorian Vance to appear. He arrived precisely 9 minutes later, uniform still on, cap in his hand, his expression as calm as a man walking into a routine appointment rather than a reprimand. Victoria stood behind her desk, arms crossed, the city skyline grey and wet behind her through floor-to-ceiling glass. "You were not authorized to touch that unit," she said without introduction. "Do you understand what could have happened if you had made things worse? We could be looking at a lawsuit, a client walking away, millions in damages, and all because a member of the cleaning staff decided he knew better than a team of licensed engineers." Dorian met her eyes without flinching and without apology in his voice. "I saw that it could be fixed," he said simply. "So I fixed it." The 5 words landed strangely in the room. Too calm, too sure of themselves for a man in a janitor's uniform standing before the CEO of a Fortune 100 company. Victoria felt something prickle at the back of her neck, an instinct she usually trusted, telling her that this was not a simple matter of an employee overstepping his role. Julian Cade, the company's chief operating officer, happened to be waiting outside for an unrelated meeting and stepped in uninvited, sensing an opportunity to appear useful in front of the woman whose favor he had spent years cultivating. "This is exactly the kind of thing that erodes structure," Julian said smoothly, addressing Victoria as though Dorian were not standing 3 feet away. If cleaning staff believe they can operate outside their job description, what happens to accountability across every department? Rebecca Hart watched the exchange with a growing discomfort she could not name. There was something in the way Dorian carried himself, an unbothered stillness that reminded her more of a man observing an experiment than a worker facing punishment. She had processed hundreds of disciplinary meetings during her years in human resources, and never once had she seen someone receive a scolding from a Fortune 100 CEO with the composure of someone reviewing a weather forecast. Victoria, however, read that same composure as insolence. And insolence was something she refused to tolerate from anyone below her, regardless of how the story might end. "Consider this your only warning," Victoria said, straightening the cuff of her blazer as though closing a chapter already decided in her mind. "You will not enter restricted engineering areas again. You will not touch company equipment outside your designated duties. And if this happens a second time, your contract with this company will be terminated immediately. No exceptions and no further conversation." Dorian simply nodded, thanked her for her time in a tone that gave away nothing, and walked out of the office with his cap still in his hand, leaving Victoria and Julian with a distinct and irritating sense that the wrong person had just left the room feeling like the winner. What neither Victoria nor Julian could have known, and what only a handful of people on Earth understood, was that Dorian Vance was not simply an employee who had wandered into the wrong lab at the wrong time. He was the only son of Margaret Sterling, the woman who had built this entire empire from a single robotics patent 40 years earlier, and he had walked away from the family business decades ago after finishing his degree at Wharton, choosing instead a quieter life built around integrity rather than inheritance. Margaret had officially stepped back from daily operations 3 years prior, handing the reins to Victoria in a highly publicized announcement that made her the youngest chief executive in the company's history. But officially and actually were 2 very different things where Margaret Sterling was concerned, and she had asked her son for one favor before she would ever consider the company's future settled. "I need to know if the people running my company still remember what it means to be human," Margaret had told him over dinner one quiet evening, her voice steady despite the years pressing on her frame. "Not on paper, not in a press release, in practice, when nobody is watching and nothing is at stake for them." Dorian had resisted at first, uninterested in games of corporate espionage dressed up as a maternal request. But something in his mother's eyes convinced him this was not vanity or nostalgia. It was fear, the quiet fear of a woman who suspected the empire she built might already be rotting from the inside. And so he agreed to disappear into the very bottom of the organizational chart to see the truth for himself. For 4 months, Dorian lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, drove a car older than some of the interns he passed in the parking garage, and carried nothing that hinted at the fortune waiting for him should he ever choose to claim it. He watched managers humiliate subordinates in meeting rooms they assumed were private. He watched executives pad expense reports while lecturing junior staff about budget discipline. He watched, more than anything, how people treated those they believed could offer them nothing in return, because Margaret had always told him that character revealed itself most honestly in the presence of those with no power to punish or reward it. Dorian had grown up watching his mother build something extraordinary from nothing. Sleeping on a cot in her first small workshop in Ohio, assembling prototype circuits with her own 2 hands, long before anyone believed a woman could lead a robotics company into a defense contract worth billions. He had absorbed, almost by accident, the very engineering instincts that later confounded certified professionals decades younger than the fortune Margaret had built, though he had spent most of his adult life deliberately walking away from any claim to that fortune. After finishing his degree at Wharton, he told his mother plainly that he had no interest in boardrooms or headlines, that he wanted a life measured by decency rather than dividends. And Margaret, though disappointed at the time, had never once tried to force his hand. It was only years later, after her health began to falter and questions of succession grew too loud to ignore, that she asked him for the one favor she had never asked before. Julian Cade, uneasy after the incident in the lab, ordered a discreet background check on the mysterious janitor who fixed million-dollar machines and spoke to CEOs without a trace of fear in his voice. The results came back frustratingly thin. A work history that seemed to begin only a handful of years earlier, references that led to dead ends, no social media presence, nothing that explained the calm intelligence radiating off a man who was supposedly paid a fraction of what any engineer in that building earned. Julian began to suspect something far more dangerous than a rule-breaking employee. He suspected a corporate spy planted by a rival firm to gather intelligence on Sterling Roth Industries' unreleased robotics and defense contracts. And that suspicion, wrong as it was, would soon set in motion a chain of decisions no one in that boardroom could take back. Victoria, meanwhile, had larger problems occupying her attention than a single janitor with unexplained talents. The board had been pressuring her for months to tighten quarterly margins ahead of a major defense contract renewal, and she decided the fastest, cleanest solution was to cut costs across what she considered the company's least essential departments. She called an emergency meeting with Rebecca Hart and outlined a plan to eliminate nearly a third of the custodial and support staff, replacing them with an outsourced overnight service that promised the same coverage for far less money. Rebecca argued against it immediately, pointing out that morale among remaining staff would suffer and that the savings were marginal compared to the disruption. But Victoria had already made up her mind before the meeting began. "These are not decisions I enjoy making," Victoria said, though her tone suggested she had already stopped thinking about it. "But a company this size cannot afford sentiment when the numbers demand discipline. Send the termination notices by the end of the week." When Rebecca pointed out that the list included the same janitor from the incident report, the one who had fixed the robotics unit and drawn Julian's suspicion, Victoria did not hesitate. If anything, she seemed relieved to have a clean procedural reason to remove someone who had unsettled her without ever raising his voice. Dorian received his termination notice on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a nervous junior staffer who could not meet his eyes as she handed him the envelope. He read it once, folded it neatly, and signed the acknowledgement form without a single word of protest. Though Rebecca, who happened to be passing through the break room at that exact moment, thought she saw something flicker behind his calm expression, not anger, but something closer to quiet disappointment. The look of a man confirming a suspicion he had hoped would prove false. "I hope you won't come to regret this," he said simply, folding the notice into his jacket pocket. And Victoria, informed of the exchange secondhand, only laughed under her breath at what she assumed was an empty threat from a man with nothing left to threaten her with. The consequences began exactly 9 days later, and they began quietly, the way real disasters often do before they become undeniable. A shipment of autonomous delivery units bound for a major logistics client malfunctioned during final testing, the navigation systems looping into the same error pattern Dorian had quietly corrected months earlier without anyone in engineering ever realizing a problem existed in the first place. Then a data server supporting 3 separate defense contracts crashed overnight, corrupting a portion of UNSIN's files and forcing an emergency call with a government liaison who did not appreciate surprises of that magnitude. Clients who had trusted Sterling Roth Industries with billion-dollar partnerships began asking pointed questions that no one on the executive floor could answer with confidence. Victoria summoned every department head into the boardroom, her composure fraying at the edges for the first time since taking the corner office. Julian, sensing the shifting winds, began quietly distancing himself from decisions he had championed only weeks earlier, redirecting blame toward the engineering team with the practiced ease of a man who had survived many storms by making sure someone else got wet first. "This is a technical failure, not a leadership failure," Julian insisted. though the tightness around his eyes told a different story to anyone paying close attention. The engineering team, for their part, insisted the systems had been stable for months, and none of them could explain why problems long thought resolved were suddenly resurfacing all at once. By the second week, the crisis had grown teeth. A major logistics partner threatened to pull a contract worth over $400 million unless the company could guarantee stability within 10 days, and a government liaison overseeing the defense partnership quietly warned that any further security lapse would trigger a formal review of the entire relationship. Reporters who covered the technology sector began asking pointed questions about leadership stability at Sterling Ruth Industries, and shares dipped nearly 6% over a single trading session, rattling board members who had spent years watching the stock climb without interruption. Victoria found herself fielding calls late into the night from investors demanding explanations she did not have. Each conversation chipping away further at the confident authority she had once worn as easily as her tailor blazers. Engineers worked through weekends trying to trace the failures to their root causes, poring over code and hardware logs until exhaustion blurred into frustration. Yet every fix seemed only to reveal another layer of instability beneath it. What none of them understood, and what Rebecca alone was beginning to suspect, was that the company's systems had quietly depended for months on a level of invisible maintenance no official process had ever tracked or credited to anyone at all. It was Rebecca who finally noticed the pattern no one else had considered. Reviewing maintenance logs late one evening, long after the rest of the floor had emptied out, she cross-referenced the malfunction reports against the quiet notes she had kept from the earlier incident, and a chill moved through her as the timeline aligned with uncomfortable precision. Every failure now crippling the company traced back to a system that had been silently and invisibly stabilized by the very man they had fired for daring to touch a broken robot. She brought her findings to Victoria the next morning, laying out the evidence with the clinical detachment of someone who already knew how unwelcome the conclusion would be. Victoria stared at the report for a long moment, the pieces refusing to fit neatly into the narrative she had built in her mind about discipline and structure and the dangers of employees who forgot their place. For the first time since the janitor had walked out of her office with his cap in his hand, she asked a question she had never bothered to ask before. Who exactly was that man? She said quietly. And Rebecca, watching the color drain slowly from her employer's face, understood that the question had come far too late to undo what was already set in motion. 3 days later, a black sedan pulled up outside the Sterling Ruth Industries tower, and an elderly woman in a plain wool coat stepped out without an entourage, without cameras, and without a single member of the staff recognizing the face that had once graced the cover of every major business magazine in the country. Margaret Sterling moved through her own lobby like a stranger, unnoticed by the young receptionists who had never worked at the company during her active years at the helm. She rode the elevator to the executive floor and let herself into a small conference room adjoining Victoria's office, where she waited in silence, listening through the thin wall as Victoria recounted her recent triumphs to a visiting board member with the practiced confidence of someone unaware that her audience had just doubled. I streamlined the custodial and support staff last month, Victoria was saying, pride evident in every syllable. Cut unnecessary overhead, tightened the whole operation. We eliminated positions that were frankly dead weight on this company's balance sheet. Margaret listened without moving, her expression unreadable until the board member excused himself and Victoria's office felt quiet enough for Margaret to finally step through the connecting door. Victoria startled, recognition flooding her face a half-second too late. The way it does when someone realizes the person standing before them is far more important than their casual entrance suggested. Mrs. Sterling, Victoria said, rising quickly, smoothing her blazer, her voice climbing an octave in surprised deference. I wasn't told you were visiting today. Margaret waved off the pleasantry with a small, tired gesture, settling into a chair without waiting for an invitation, her eyes studying Victoria the way a jeweler studies a stone before deciding whether it holds any real value beneath the polish. Tell me about this custodial staff you eliminated, Margaret said, her voice soft but carrying an edge Victoria had never heard from her before. Tell me specifically about the man who cleaned the 42nd floor. Victoria hesitated, sensing danger without understanding its source. He was, a contractor, talented in some unconventional ways, but he crossed lines regarding authorized access, and I made the decision to let him go along with several others as part of a cost restructuring. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, her silence stretching until it felt heavier than any shouted accusation could have been. Then she rose from her chair, straightened her coat, and delivered 4 words that would haunt Victoria for the rest of the week. Call the board together, Margaret said. That evening, The emergency board meeting convened at 7 o'clock. 12 directors gathered around the long glass table with the particular tension of people summoned without explanation by a woman they had assumed retired for good. Victoria took her usual seat at the head of the table, still believing against every instinct, now screaming otherwise, that this meeting existed to celebrate her cost-cutting initiatives rather than to unravel them. She opened with a brief, confident summary of the quarter's efficiency gains, gesturing toward projected savings on the screen behind her, unaware that Margaret had already connected a laptop to the room's display system and was simply waiting for her to finish. "Thank you, Victoria," Margaret said once the younger woman had settled back into her chair, her tone pleasant in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than anger would have. "Before we discuss the quarter, I'd like to show the board something I've been reviewing over the past several days." She pressed a key and the screen filled with security footage timestamped across 4 months, showing the same man in a grey uniform moving quietly through server rooms, engineering labs, and production floors long after most employees had gone home for the night. The room watched in silence as the footage cycled through dozens of small, invisible interventions. A corrupted server rerouted before anyone noticed the corruption. A defective assembly line halted moments before it would have shipped faulty parts to a defense client. A fire suppression system recalibrated after a fault that would have triggered a costly evacuation the following week. No one in the room spoke as the montage continued, each clip more damning than the last in its quiet demonstration of competence that far exceeded any job title listed on the man's employment file. Julian felt sweat gather at his collar, calculating rapidly how much of this had happened directly under decisions he himself had championed. Victoria's confident posture had collapsed entirely by the 3rd minute, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though the floor itself might give way beneath her. When the footage finally ended, Margaret closed the laptop gently and looked around the table with the calm, terrible patience of a woman who had been right about something painful for a very long time. "That man's name is Dorian Vance," Margaret said into the silence. "He has for 4 months quietly prevented no fewer than 7 catastrophic failures that would have cost this company hundreds of millions of dollars, and very possibly our government contracts entirely." She paused, letting the number settle over the room like a physical weight. "You just terminated the employment of my son, the sole heir to this company, and the only person in this building who understood exactly how fragile everything you've built truly is." The silence that followed was the kind that seemed to press against the walls of the room itself. Julian's face had gone the color of old paper, his mind racing through every conversation he had used to nudge Victoria toward decisions that serve his own ambitions rather than the company's health. Victoria sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, searching for words that refused to arrive, the carefully constructed image of her own competence crumbling in real time before 12 of the most powerful people in the industry. One director finally broke the silence, asking the question every person in the room was thinking but too stunned to voice aloud. "Where is he now?" And Margaret, rising from her chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had waited a long time for this moment, answered simply, "Ask him yourself." The doors to the boardroom opened and Dorian Vance walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit instead of a janitor's uniform, his presence utterly transformed and yet somehow exactly the same. The same unhurried calm, the same steady eyes that had unsettled Victoria from the very first conversation in her office. Legal counsel followed a step behind him, carrying a folder that would soon confirm what Margaret had already announced, that Dorian held 38% ownership in Sterling Roth Industries, a veto right over major board decisions, and standing as the sole named heir to the company's controlling trust. Victoria stared at him as though seeing a stranger for the first time, though of course she had seen this exact man dozens of times, simply never seen him at all. "Mr. Vance," one board member said, half rising from his seat out of pure instinct, and Dorian gestured gently for everyone to remain seated, taking the empty chair beside his mother rather than the head of the table that was technically his to claim. Victoria found her voice at last, though it came out thinner than she intended. "I had no idea," she started, and Dorian held up a hand, not unkindly, but with enough quiet authority that she stopped mid-sentence. "I know," he said. "That was rather the point of the uniform." Julian attempted a defense, some tangled explanation about protocol and structure and the necessity of maintaining boundaries within an organization their size. But his words unraveled further with every sentence, especially once legal counsel produced records of expense manipulations and internal communications showing Julian had spent months positioning himself as indispensable while quietly undermining several colleagues to secure his own advancement. Margaret watched her old company's chief operating officer dig his own grave with visible, if weary, satisfaction. By the time the board voted to remove Julian from his position entirely, Effective immediately, he barely protested, some part of him seeming almost relieved that the performance was finally over. Victoria, once the board's attention shifted back toward her, rose from her seat with the stiff dignity of someone preparing to accept the inevitable. "I'll submit my resignation by morning," she said quietly, addressing Margaret rather than Dorian, as though she still could not fully process that the quiet man beside her held more power over her future than anyone else in the room. Dorian spoke before his mother could respond, his tone even but carrying an unmistakable weight. "That won't be necessary," he said. And the room, already stunned once that evening, found itself stunned again. "I have a question for you first," Dorian continued, turning to face Victoria directly for the first time since entering the room. "If I truly had been nothing more than a janitor, the man you believed me to be for 4 months, would you have treated me any differently than you did?" Victoria opened her mouth and closed it again, the question landing somewhere far more uncomfortable than any accusation could have reached. She thought of every dismissive glance she had allowed herself, every assumption she had made about a man's worth based entirely on the uniform he wore rather than the mind operating beneath it, and she found she could not answer honestly without condemning herself completely. "No," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, the single syllable costing her more than any resignation letter ever could. "I wouldn't have." Dorian nodded slowly, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to quiet sadness, as though her honesty confirmed exactly the fear his mother had carried into this experiment from its very beginning. "That's the problem," he said. "Not that you fired a janitor. That you would have treated any janitor exactly the same way, and never once questioned whether that was right." Julian, already stripped of his title and gathering the last of his composure before being escorted from the building, muttered something bitter about how power always finds a way to protect itself. But no one in the room bothered to respond to him anymore. Victoria, tears finally breaking free after holding them back through sheer force of will, asked the question that had been building in her chest since the moment the footage first appeared on the screen. "What happens to me now?" She asked, and the room waited, uncertain whether mercy or ruin was about to follow. "A single mistake does not define an entire life," Dorian said, and something in his voice suggested this was not simply a lesson he was teaching her, but one he had learned himself somewhere along a difficult road of his own. "You made decisions rooted in fear and pride rather than understanding, and those decisions cost this company dearly. But I did not walk these hallways in a uniform for 4 months just to watch you lose everything over it. I did it to find out whether the people leading my mother's company were capable of change when confronted with the truth about themselves." Victoria wiped her eyes, uncertain whether she deserved the chance being offered to her, and Margaret, watching her son with quiet pride from across the table, said nothing at all, letting the moment belong entirely to him. In the weeks that followed, Dorian did not seize the chief executive title for himself, though the board and his mother both expected him to. Instead, he proposed something that struck several directors as unconventional, bordering on reckless: a mandatory rotation program requiring every senior executive, beginning with Victoria herself, to spend 1 full month working directly alongside the company's lowest paid roles before advancing to any leadership position. Going forward, executives would clean floors, staff the front desk, serve meals in the company cafeteria, and stand guard at the loading docks, not as punishment, but as a permanent reminder of the human infrastructure holding up everything the glass tower represented. Several board members balked at first, calling it inefficient, even embarrassing for a company of this stature. But Dorian held firm, and Margaret, who had waited decades to see her company confront this exact blind spot, backed him without hesitation. Victoria volunteered to be the first executive through the program, though volunteer was perhaps too generous a word for a decision made with little real alternative available to her. She spent 4 weeks mopping the very floors Dorian once cleaned, serving coffee to employees who had once feared crossing her path in a hallway, and standing at the loading dock in the cold morning air, learning firsthand how differently the world treated a person once the title disappeared from her badge. She came to understand, slowly and sometimes painfully. The quiet dignity Dorian had carried through every dismissive glance and every careless comment directed his way during his own months of invisibility. By the end of the program, something in her had shifted permanently, a hardness worn away by weeks of standing where she had once refused to look. One afternoon, during her 3rd week, while sweeping the same stretch of hallway where she had once confronted Dorian over the broken robot, Victoria recognized a face among the passing engineers and realized it belonged to Ethan Cole, the young man whose panic had set off the very crisis that eventually unraveled her career. He offered her a cup of coffee from the break room without a trace of resentment, and the small kindness of the gesture struck her harder than any boardroom reprimand ever could have. She found herself apologizing quietly, not for any single decision, but for an entire way of seeing people that she had never before questioned. And Ethan, surprised but gracious, simply told her that everyone eventually learns the same lesson. Some just get to learn it before it costs them everything. By the final week of her rotation, Victoria had stopped counting the days until it would end. She began arriving early, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine curiosity about the small rhythms of a life she had spent years walking past without seeing. The exact moment the loading dock grew busiest, the particular care with which the overnight cleaning crew treated equipment they were never even trained to operate. When the program officially concluded, several of her former colleagues expected her to shed the experience like an ill-fitting costume the moment she returned to her office, but instead she asked Rebecca to make the rotation permanent policy for every incoming executive, herself included, on an annual basis going forward. Ethan Cole, the young engineer whose trembling hands had triggered the very first crisis in that opening week, found himself unexpectedly promoted to lead a new division focused on preventive maintenance, a role that existed specifically because Dorian had insisted the company needed people who noticed problems quietly long before they became expensive disasters. Ethan often told newer hires that the strangest and most valuable lesson of his career had come not from a professor or a mentor, but from watching a janitor solve in 6 minutes what his entire team had failed to understand in 6 hours. He kept framed above his desk a photograph of the very robot Dorian had once repaired, less as a trophy and more as a quiet reminder of how easily talent could be overlooked when it arrived in an unexpected uniform. Rebecca Hart, promoted to oversee a newly created Office of Workplace Culture, built an entire framework around the principle Dorian had insisted upon from the very beginning, that no employee's contribution should ever be measured solely by their title or their salary. Complaint lines that once gathered dust began filling with genuine feedback, addressed promptly rather than filed away and forgotten. Managers who had once ruled through fear found themselves retrained or replaced entirely, and for the first time in the company's long history, turnover among entry-level staff dropped to numbers the board had never imagined possible. Word spread slowly at first, then quickly through industry circles that Sterling Roth Industries had become something rare among corporations of its size. A place where the person who fixed a broken machine and the person who approved its budget stood on genuinely equal footing. Nearly a year after that fateful board meeting, national business publications began ranking Sterling Roth Industries among the finest places in the country to build a career, citing its unusual rotation program and its transparent culture as evidence that a company's soul could survive even after decades of prioritizing results above everything else. Victoria, restored to her position as chief executive but forever changed by the lessons of that single autumn, led the company with